Imagine you are walking along a mountain road in old Japan, in the kind of autumn evening when the air smells of wood smoke and fallen leaves, and the last light is turning the maples along the ridgeline into something almost too beautiful to be real. The path narrows. Mist is rising from a stream somewhere below, curling through the undergrowth in slow, pale ribbons. And just ahead of you, sitting perfectly still at the edge of the tree line, is a fox. Not a large fox. Reddish gold, with a white-tipped tail and eyes that seem, in this particular light, to hold something more than animal intelligence. It watches you. You watch it. And for a moment that stretches longer than it should, neither of you moves. In Japan, this is not an ordinary encounter, because in Japan, foxes are not simply foxes. They are kitsune, shapeshifters, tricksters, lovers, guardians, spirits who can live for 1,000 years and grow up to 9 tails, each one earned over a century of accumulated wisdom. And the stories the Japanese have told about them for more than 1,300 years are some of the strangest, most beautiful, and most heartbreaking tales in all of world mythology. If you find these ancient stories as fascinating as I do, go ahead and subscribe. We tell a new one every week, and the Japanese tales are among the most extraordinary ever imagined. Now, to understand Kitsune, you need to understand something about the Japanese relationship with the natural world that is quite different from the Western tradition. In Europe, the line between the human world and the wild was sharp. Forests were dangerous. Wolves were enemies. Civilization meant pushing nature back behind walls and hedgerows and fields of wheat. But in Japan, the boundary was softer, more permeable, and far more interesting. The islands themselves seemed to encourage it. Those volcanic mountains wrapped in cloud, those bamboo groves where the light filtered down green and strange, those winding paths through cedar forests where the air was so still that you could hear a single leaf falling from 20 paces away. The wild and the civilized were not enemies. They were neighbors, separated by a threshold so thin that on certain nights, at certain crossroads, in certain weather, a spirit could step across it and walk among humans undetected. Kitsune lived on that threshold. They were shapeshifters who could take human form, most often as beautiful women, sometimes as old men, occasionally as children. The transformation was said to begin when a fox reached 50 years of age, though some stories place the requirement at 100. They could create illusions so vivid that a traveler might spend an entire evening in a grand mansion, eating fine food and drinking warm sake from porcelain cups that felt perfectly real against his lips, only to wake the next morning in an empty field, his mouth tasting of dirt and grass, with nothing around him but wet earth and the sound of crows calling in the grey dawn. They could possess people, start fires, drive men mad with desire, and steal rice from the finest storehouses in the province. But they could also fall in love. They could be faithful. They could weep. And this is where the Kitsune stories become something more than folklore, because the best of them are not about tricks or terror. They are about what happens when something wild tries to live as something tame, and what is lost when the disguise finally falls away. The most famous Kitsune story in Japan the one every child knows, is the Tale of Kuzunoha. And it begins, as so many great stories do, with an act of unexpected kindness. A nobleman named Abe no Yasuna was traveling through the countryside near Osaka when he came upon a fox hunt. The autumn fields were golden with harvested stubble, and the air carried that particular sharpness that comes just before the first frost. A group of men with dogs were chasing a white fox through those fields, and the fox was clearly exhausted, its breath coming in ragged gasps, its legs trembling as it tried to outrun the hounds. Its white fur was streaked with mud, and its eyes were wide with a fear that looked almost human. Yasuna did not think, he simply acted. He stepped between the hunters and the fox, took a blow meant for the animal, and told the men to leave the creature alone. Whether it was his rank, his determination, or something in the sheer foolishness of his gesture that stopped them, we do not know. But the hunters left. The fox disappeared into the tall grass, and Yasuna, bruised and bleeding from a cut above his eye, continued on his way alone. Some days later, a woman appeared at his door. She was extraordinarily beautiful, quiet and graceful, with something in her eyes that reminded him of autumn light through temple windows. She wore a pale robe the color of moonlight on still water, and she moved with a lightness that made the wooden floor seem reluctant to hold her weight. She said her name was Kuzunoha, which means leaf of the camphor tree. She said she had nowhere to go, and because kindness had already proven itself to be Yasuna's defining quality, he invited her in. They married. They were happy. She bore him a son, a boy they named Seimei, and for several years the household was filled with the kind of gentle, domestic warmth that needs no dramatic arc to be worth describing. The sound of a child laughing in a garden where persimmons were ripening on the branch. The smell of rice cooking in the evening while rain tapped softly on the wooden eaves. Her voice humming an old song whose words she could not quite remember. Footsteps on a wooden floor. The rustling of silk as she knelt to arrange flowers. These small things, these precious, ordinary things that become, in retrospect, the most important things of all. But children see what adults do not. One afternoon, young Seimei noticed something impossible. His mother had fallen asleep in the garden, leaning against the trunk of a plum tree whose blossoms had already fallen. And in her sleep, her human shape had loosened, the way a garment loosens when the wearer stops holding it in place. A fox tail, white-tipped and soft as silk, had slipped out from beneath her robe. The boy cried out. Kuzunoha woke, and in that moment she knew that her life as a human woman was over. She could not stay. The old stories are clear on this. Once a kitsune's true nature is revealed, the spell breaks. The human life cannot be sustained. The threshold between worlds, once visible, cannot be made invisible again. And so Kuzunoha did what generations of Japanese storytellers decided she must do. She wrote a poem on the sliding screen of their bedroom, using not a brush but her own claw, each stroke delicate and precise. If you love me, come find me. Come to the great forest of Shinoda. And then she was gone, not through the door, not through the window, through the boundary between the human world and the wild one, back across that thin threshold she had managed to cross for a few brief, precious years. Let that image settle in your mind for a moment. A fox sitting in an empty room where a woman used to be. A poem scratched on a paper screen. And a child who would grow up to become the most famous diviner in Japanese history. Because Seimei, the half-fox boy, became Abe no Seimei, the legendary onmyoji, a master of spiritual arts whose abilities were said to come directly from his Kitsune blood. He could see spirits that were invisible to ordinary eyes. He could command them. He could read the currents of fate the way a fisherman reads the currents of a river. The fox's gift to the man who had once saved her was not just love. It was a lineage of power that would shape the course of Japanese spiritual history for centuries. And this is where the Kitsune tradition connects to something much larger. Because fox spirits are not unique to Japan. The Chinese told stories of Huli Jing fox spirits who could take human form after cultivating their powers for centuries, meditating in moonlight, absorbing the essence of yin and yang until their bodies could hold any shape they chose. Some Chinese fox spirits were scholars. Some were poets. Some were simply lonely creatures who wanted nothing more than a warm house and a human conversation. In Korea, the Gumiho, the nine-tailed fox, was a creature of terrifying beauty who seduced men and consumed their livers or their hearts, a predator in silk. And in parts of India, fox spirits appeared in village tales as shape-shifting tricksters who rewarded the generous and punished the cruel. The fox wife, the animal lover who crosses into the human world, is one of the oldest story patterns on Earth, as old as the campfire itself. But the Japanese version is unique in its tenderness. In China, fox spirits were often dangerous. In Korea, the Gumiho was almost always a villain. But in Japan, the Kitsune wife was more often than not a figure of pure heartbreak. She loved too well. She stayed too long. And when she left behind something irreplaceable. Now, the tale of Kuzunoha is the gentle face of Kitsune folklore. But before we meet the darker foxes, it is worth understanding something about the nature of Kitsune power itself, because it is unlike anything in Western mythology. A Kitsune grows stronger with age, and the measure of that strength is its tails. A young fox spirit, newly awakened to its powers at 50 or 100 years of age, has a single tail and can manage only simple tricks, small illusions, brief transformations that might fool a farmer on a dark road, but would not survive the scrutiny of daylight. As the centuries pass and the fox accumulates wisdom, experience, and spiritual energy, it grows additional tails. A three-tailed fox can sustain a human disguise for months. A five-tailed fox can create entire landscapes of illusion, buildings and gardens and dinner guests that feel as real as anything in the waking world. And a nine-tailed fox, a Kubai no Kitsune, is something close to divine. It has lived for 1,000 years or more. Its fur, the stories say, turns from red to silver and then to gold, or sometimes to a white so pure that it seems to glow in the dark. It can see the past and the future. It can hear conversations happening miles away. It can manipulate fate itself, nudging events and people the way a wind nudges clouds across the sky. The number 9 held special significance in East Asian cosmology. In Chinese tradition, 9 was the most auspicious number, associated with the emperor and with heaven itself. In Japanese Buddhism, 9 was the number of levels of consciousness. So a 9-tailed fox was not merely old, it was complete. It had passed through every stage of spiritual development that a fox could pass through. And what it had become was something that the human categories of good and evil could not quite contain. This idea that power grows with patience and time rather than through conquest or violence is something the Kitsune share with very few mythological traditions. Most Western heroes gain their power quickly through a magical gift, a divine blessing, or a single moment of transformation. But the Kitsune earn their power slowly, tale by tale, century by century, one patient lifetime at a time. There is something deeply calming about that idea, if you let it settle. But foxes in Japan had many faces, and not all of them were kind. The Japanese recognized two broad categories of fox spirit. The first were Maiabu, the celestial foxes, servants of Inari, the god of rice, fertility, and prosperity. If you have ever seen photographs of Fushimi Inari Taisha, the great shrine in Kyoto, with its 10,000 vermilion torii gates climbing up a forested mountainside, then you have seen their home. The stone foxes that sit at the entrance of Inari shrines throughout Japan, one holding a jewel in its mouth and the other a scroll, are not guardians against foxes. They are foxes, messengers of the god, trusted emissaries between the divine and the mortal. There are more than 30,000 Inari shrines in Japan, making it the most common type of shrine in the country. Every one of them has fox statues at its gates. The air at Fushimi Inari is cool and dim, even on the hottest summer day. The torii gates create a tunnel of vermilion wood and shadow that climbs the mountain in what feels like an endless procession, each gate donated by a different worshipper, each one inscribed with names and dates and prayers. The red lacquer catches the light in bands, so that walking through them feels like passing through alternating strips of fire and darkness. Moss grows on the stone steps between the gates. The smell of cedar and incense hangs in the still air, and the stone foxes peer out from alcoves between the gates, some ancient and weather-worn with lichen growing in the cracks of their ears, some fresh and sharp-featured with bright painted eyes, all of them watching the pilgrims pass with that same expression of knowing patience that you might see on the face of a creature that has been waiting for someone for a very long time. The second category of Kitsune were the Nojitsune, the wild foxes. These were the tricksters, the possessors, the ones who had no allegiance to any god and answered only to their own appetites and amusements. A Nojitsune might lead a traveler astray with foxfire, those ghostly lights that floated in fields and forests at night, cold and pale and impossible to follow to their source. Kitsune, the Japanese called them. They appeared as pale blue or greenish flames, sometimes singly, sometimes in long processions that wound across rice paddies and through bamboo groves like lantern bearers at a ghost festival. They gave no warmth. They cast no shadows, and they moved with a purposefulness that suggested intelligence, drifting slowly ahead of the traveler, always just out of reach, always just bright enough to follow, leading the unwary deeper and deeper into the dark until the path was lost and the familiar world had disappeared entirely. But the wild foxes could do worse than mislead. They could possess. Kitsune Yuki, fox possession, was one of the most feared afflictions in traditional Japan. It usually struck women, entering the body through the fingernails or the breast, and the symptoms were dramatic. The possessed person would develop a craving for rice and red bean paste, the fox's favorite foods. She would speak in a voice that was not her own. She would exhibit physical strength far beyond normal. And sometimes, if you looked carefully at the shadow she cast by firelight, you would see not the outline of a woman, but the outline of a fox, with pointed ears and a long, narrow snout. Think about that for a moment. An entire branch of spiritual medicine devoted to diagnosing and curing fox possession. That is how deeply woven into daily life the Kitsune were. They were not distant figures of legend, safely contained in books and scrolls. They were present, active, and unpredictable, as close as the nearest shrine and as dangerous as the nearest shadow. And then there is the most dramatic Kitsune legend of all, the story of Tamamo-no-Mae. If Kuzunoha represents the gentle, loving fox spirit, Tamamo-no-Mae represents its opposite, the fox of terrible beauty and terrible ambition. In the 12th century, a woman of extraordinary beauty appeared at the imperial court. She called herself Tamamo-no-Mae, and she was so intelligent, so refined, and so breathtakingly lovely that the emperor himself fell under her spell. She could answer any question on any subject, from poetry to astronomy to the proper interpretation of Chinese philosophical texts. Her skin was said to glow faintly in candlelight, as if she were lit from within. Her hair never fell out of place. No matter how many hours she spent in the dusty, incense-heavy halls of the court, her robes never showed a single crease, and she carried about her a scent of white plum blossoms that no one could trace to any perfume. The emperor was enchanted. The court was enchanted. But the court astrologer, a man trained in the very arts that Abe-no-Seimei had mastered generations earlier, was not. He performed a divination, and what he discovered shook the court to its foundations. Tamamo-no-Mae was not a woman. She was a Kubai no Kitsune, a nine-tailed fox, the most powerful and ancient of all fox spirits. She had lived for thousands of years. She had appeared under different names and different faces at the courts of ancient China and India, always seducing rulers, always whispering poison into the ears of power, always bringing ruin. The Shang dynasty of China, the stories said, had fallen because of her influence there, where she had been known as Daji, the concubine whose cruelty was legendary. She was not merely a fox pretending to be beautiful. She was a force of destruction that had walked among civilizations for millennia, wearing beauty like a weapon. When her true nature was exposed, Tamamo-no-Mae fled the court. The emperor sent his two greatest warriors to hunt her down. They chased her across the northern provinces, through forests of black pine and over mountains, where the snow never fully melted, until at last they cornered her on the plains of Nasu. And there the beautiful fox, the ancient fox, the nine-tailed fox who had outlived empires, finally died. But her spirit did not rest. It entered a great stone, and that stone became the Seshoseki, the killing stone, and anything that approached it, birds, insects, humans, fell dead. The grass around it turned brown. The air above it shimmered with a heat that had no visible source. The stone sat on that plain for centuries, radiating poison and malice, until a Buddhist monk named Jeno performed the rituals that finally released the fox's spirit. And even then, the stories say, the stone still carried a faint trace of warmth, as though something inside it had not quite finished burning. Let that sink in for a moment. It is worth pausing here to notice how different the Tamamo-no-Mae story is from the Tale of Kuzunoha. Both are fox women. Both are beautiful. Both live among humans. But one gives love and the other takes power. And the Japanese told both stories, held both truths simultaneously, because the Kitsune was never meant to be just one thing. It was meant to be complicated, the way nature itself is complicated. The same rain that waters the rice fields can flood the village. The same mountain that shelters the shrine can shake the earth beneath it. The same fox that blesses your household with prosperity can curse your neighbor with madness. And there were gentler stories still. Stories of foxes who repaid kindness with gifts of rice or gold, appearing as strangers at the door during lean winters with baskets of food that never quite seemed to empty. Stories of fox mothers who watched over their half-human children from the edges of forests, never approaching, never revealing themselves, but leaving small signs. A rabbit left on the doorstep, a path cleared of snow on a morning when no one else had been outside. Stories of travelers who found shelter in mysterious inns on stormy nights, inns that vanished by morning but left the traveler feeling rested and well fed, with the faintest scent of something wild, something like wet fur and autumn leaves, lingering in their clothes. The Japanese understood that the wild world was not merely dangerous, it was also, at times, deeply generous. One such tale from the Kenjaku Monogatari issue, a collection of stories compiled in the 12th century, tells of a poor woodcutter who found a fox caught in a snare on a winter morning when the snow lay thick on the ground and the cold was bitter enough to crack the bark of trees. The fox looked at him with dark eyes and did not struggle. The woodcutter freed it. He asked for nothing in return. He simply cut the cord and walked on, his feet crunching through the frozen crust, his breath rising in white clouds. That night, a stranger came to his door carrying a sack of rice, so heavy the man could barely lift it. The stranger said nothing about a fox. He said only that someone had asked him to deliver this gift, and then he bowed and disappeared into the falling snow. The woodcutter and his family ate well that winter, and each year, on the anniversary of the day he had freed the fox, a sack of rice appeared on his doorstep, delivered by strangers who never gave their names and never explained how they had been paid. These stories of fox gratitude share a common thread. The fox never reveals itself directly. The gift arrives through intermediaries, through coincidence, through events that could be explained without magic, but that carry, if you are willing to see it, the unmistakable signature of something watching from just beyond the edge of the visible world. So what do the Kitsune tell us about the people who created them? Why did the Japanese, of all the world's cultures, develop the richest and most emotionally complex fox mythology? Perhaps it has something to do with the landscape itself. Japan is a country where the mountains begin at the edge of the rice paddies, where the forest is never more than a few minutes' walk from the village, where mist rolls down from the peaks every morning and retreats every afternoon like a tide. The wild is always there, always visible, always close enough to touch. You do not need to travel to find it. You only need to turn around. And in a landscape like that, the most interesting question is not whether the wild is dangerous. Of course it is. The most interesting question is whether it is also beautiful, and whether the things that cross from it into our world bring gifts as well as curses. The Kitsune answered both questions with yes. Yes, the wild is beautiful. Yes, it brings gifts. But the gifts come with conditions, and the beauty comes with grief, and neither can be had without the other. There is a particular quality to the best Kitsune tales that separates them from fox stories in other cultures. In China, the fox spirit stories tend toward the dramatic and the cautionary. The Huli Jing is powerful, seductive, dangerous, a creature of appetite and ambition. In Korea, the Gyumiho is almost always a villain, a beautiful monster who must consume human essence to survive. But in Japan, the Kitsune stories carry a quality that the Japanese call mono-no-aware, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence. The beauty of a thing is inseparable from its passing. The cherry blossoms are beautiful because they fall. The fox wife is beautiful because she must leave. And this, perhaps, is why the Kitsune endure in Japanese culture in a way that fox spirits do not endure in China or Korea. You will find Kitsune in anime and manga, in video games and novels, in films and television dramas. You will find fox masks at every summer festival in Japan, bright red and white, grinning with painted whiskers, worn by children and lovers and old men who remember the stories their grandmothers told them. You will find the stone foxes at every Inari shrine, still keeping watch, still holding their jewels and their scrolls, still serving a god who was old when the first emperor sat on the chrysanthemum throne. The Kitsune are not relics of a forgotten past. They are alive in the Japanese imagination in a way that few mythological creatures are alive anywhere in the modern world. And the reason, I think, is that they embody a truth that most mythology only circles around. The boundary between the wild and the civilized is not a wall, it is a door. And sometimes, on certain autumn evenings, when the maples are burning and the mist is rising from the stream, the door opens. What passes through it might be dangerous. It might be wonderful. It might break your heart. But the Japanese have always understood that the passage itself, the crossing of that threshold, is where the most important